Okay. Sorry. There we go. All right, here we go. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Okay, so we're going to continue with our explanation from the book al-Muhadhdhab min al-Fiqh al-Maliki wa adillatuhu by Shaykh al-Zakāh al-Majjājī hafidhahullah. So this is the book on the pruning of Maliki Fiqh based upon proofs and evidences by the Algerian scholar Shaykh Zakāh al-Majjājī. May Allah Ta'ala preserve him. Okay, so this is our third session in the chapter on Zakāh. As I said just before the break, there's two sections that we did a little bit last week about livestock, and there's a lot more notes in there. And so, as I said, I wanted this to really to be like more practical, at least in the first approach. And so, because most of us don't have livestock or crops, I'm going to take that part of the book and just put it as a post that everybody can reference. So I'll send out that link shortly. So what we're going to do today is actually look at today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the zakah of al-dhahab and fidda, look at the zakah of gold and silver, because either ourselves or our wives will probably have gold and silver either as like wealth or investment things or jewelry. So this, I think, will be a little bit more practical. Not that we don't need to know those other aspects of the zakah, but like I said, just for practicality's sake, I'll put those up so you can reference them, inshallah. I also put here at the beginning of the PDF, again, I'll upload and put online, some of the like mustalahat and mufradat, like some of the terminology and the terms, so that also we can slowly fold those in to use those. So very succinctly, I put in like dhahab and fidda, right, gold and silver respectively. Mafruda, something that is mandatory. It's the feminine of mafrud, related to the word fard, meaning something that's compulsory. You have al-halyi, which is like jewelry, which is interesting because it's related to the word hilu. So jewelry is something that tazyin makes something more beautiful. And then you have al-musta'mal, jewelry that also, it can include jewelry, but it can also be gold or silver that is either also has some type of utility to it, right? And then hawalan al-hawl, so the passing of a year in terms of how to determine zakah over that period of time. Then, of course, dinar and dirham. These are types of coins of gold and silver that have been traditionally used in Muslim lands. Naqad and naqdi, this is what you can think of, things that are like cash or things that are liquid. Thaman and athman, like the value or the price of a thing. And then qima and qimi, also like kind of fungible or non-fungible valued things. All right, so Kitab al-Zakāh, fasl fi zakat al-dhahab wa al-fidda. So now we're going to take a little bit more of a detailed look of zakah on gold and silver. And as the Shaykh says, وَمَا جَرَى مَجْرَاهُمَا, and what is equivalent to them. So he says first, az-zakah mafruda. Zakah is mandatory. الذهب والفضة, as it applies to gold and silver. Let me make sure that if there's any questions, all right, good. So as it applies to gold and silver, and he says, على أي صفة كانا, in whatever forms they may be, إلا, with some exception of what he says, what al-hilyi, al-mubah, the types of jewelry that are permissible to wear. And by permissible, because obviously there's ibaha lil-rijal wal-nisa, right? There's permissibility of jewelry to wear for women that differs for men. Like men, we don't wear gold, right? And for women, they can wear gold and silver. Yes.
That was actually something that came up. My kids were What about the earrings for men?
Earrings? Earrings are permissible because this is an urf. Now, in some cultures, this is where you have people like Imam al-Qarafi and other people of usul, where they say, like, مثلا, al-ada muhakkama, right? That a custom is how you determine the application of the hukum. So, for instance, we know tashabba, right? Ar-rijal nisa haram, and then the reverse, right? Like, so men imitating women is haram in Islam. However, in different cultures, the wearing of an earring is not necessarily something that is mu'annith or mudhakkar fi dhatihi, like it's purely masculine or feminine. And that even then there can be different styles in which, so for instance, men and women wear shirts. Now, in some circles, they used to consider wearing pink a feminine color. But is it haram to wear a pink shirt? No, you cannot say this is like, it's not haram to wear a pink shirt. Now, could you wear a shirt that is like a blouse that's like cut in a woman's style within a particular cultural context? Absolutely. Would this be considered tashabbuh? Absolutely. And so from that, we get ada muhakkama, right? We get that idea of that from that point of view, yes, then you could make the hukum that this would not be permissible. So wearing an earring in and of itself is not something that is like qat'i haram, like just beyond the pale of haram. Now, whether you like it or don't like it, that's you say, I don't like for me personally, I just find the idea of doing this just like, I don't know, that feels feminine for me personally, right? But can I say that this is an obligation that all Muslims have to follow? Because let's just be honest, particularly in Black American culture, men wear this type of tazjeen, this type of jewelry, this kind of halyi. And that traditionally, there's a strong sense of masculinity in traditional Black culture. So I know plenty of brothers that wore earrings and they were not soft in any kind of way. Again, for me, I don't know, just because maybe the house that I grew up in and, my parents also being, it's a generational thing. Like my parents are in the 80s and 90s, so you just didn't find Black men, wearing that kind of thing. So being influenced by my parents' cultural heritage and whatnot, I ain't really comfortable with that. But I remember when my middle brother started wearing an earring and my dad was like, like, what is that? But again, we have to be careful of not taking things to stretching them beyond the bounds. Now we can say, I don't like it. I don't think you should do it. But again, just making everything black and white, halal, haram, no. So, but then there's also, there are some concerns about the imitation, because again, we find this mainly as a tradition in the West, as something that is a custom of the non-Muslims, that's indicative to the non-Muslims. And so I would be cautionary if I had a son of allowing them to do so, but I don't think I could come out and say like, oh, this is something that is punishable, has a head, or requires tawbah, or that Allah Ta'ala will punish you in the next life, and so on and so on. So again, we have to be very careful of going to excessive extremes or extending the scope of something beyond its due. We can still say, I don't like it. Like I said, for me, I never have had my ears pierced, never will, inshallah. It just, I can't do this. It just feels wrong, but I cannot extend that beyond the boundaries to where I could make like a, that kind of declarative statement. Yes. This is an interesting tangent for zakah, by the way. But anyway, yeah. So do you have to pay zakah on your... The simple answer is no, because it would be considered halyi.
Could an argument not be made that this type of tazeen, so like men wearing earrings or wearing certain colors, or women, for example, wearing clothing nowadays that traditionally would have been associated more with male clothing, so like wearing jeans and shirts and suits and stuff like that. Could an argument not be made that these types of changes are a result of the sort of androgenization of society, or as a result?
Sure, I mean,
and that might be problematic if we were to follow in those
right.
those things.
So I'll repeat just in case the mic didn't pick it up for those who are online. So the question was like, could the argument not be made? And that's the first part to highlight, an argument. Could the argument not be made that adopting these customs or like even changes in clothing, say like women wearing pants or jeans, or what, could this not be, or an argument be made that this could be in the imitation of the kuffar? Well,
Not even necessarily imitation.
oh, I'm sorry, the androgenization of men and women. I mean, like, blurring the line between what is distinctly male and distinctly
Like you
female.
mentioned, for example, like traditionally black men would never wear like earrings and things like that, whereas maybe black men or other men nowadays would wear that. And like,
Yeah. I mean, certainly can an argument, arguments could always be made for virtually, almost any number of things. So a person could make an argument. This is basically what we would call iftā. Like you could, if you had the actual, capacity, you could make a fatwa. You could construct an argument, an opinion that would not be binding on the entire community, but if a person wanted to adopt it, that'd perfectly be fine. And you could say that, this seems to be about shab al-rijal nisa, right? Like it's like a kind of androgenization of men and women. When women start wearing the same clothes as men, then okay, perhaps. A counter argument could be made in that you take like the verse in Surah An-Nur where Allah talks about the thiyab of women. So we tend to think as a thobe, like in the modern context, when you say the word thobe, right? Like, I mean, this is a jalab technically, but a thobe is something that is seen as like libas rijal. It's like a men's thing. Like you don't tend to think of like we would in the modern context, we would talk about she wears like an abaya or this or that. But we don't tend to typically apply the word thobe to women. The Quran, though, however, talks about the thiyab of women in Surah An-Nur, like on those verses related to them having to wear hijab and whatnot, right? And so is the Quran saying like there are some things that are just general categorizations? So like the word, meaning like the word thobe in one context can be specific, but in another context, it can be general. So in like thobe can in some context be just like libas. Because if Allah Ta'ala is saying that women wear thobes and men wear thobes, well then obviously men and women don't imitate each other in their dress in Islam. So in some context, a thobe, assalamu alaikum, a thobe has to be, in a certain context, it has to be general. But then obviously in another context, it can be specific. So the simple answer is yes, an argument can be constructed. The question is not can the argument can be constructed, but to what scope or extent does the community have to follow that? And the simple answer is very limited. I can make a fatwa about a great many number of things, but that doesn't mean that the community is under any obligation, mean lock, stock, and barrel, everybody got to follow it. But I could make an argument, and it could be a legitimate argument, right? This is where, it's funny, we talked about, Jibril and I were with Dr. Jackson the other day, and Sheikh Jibril. It's hard hanging out with Jibril and Sheikh Jibril because they're like, who's Jibril? You know, because I told my wife the other day, I'm going to go meet Jibril. And then I saw, so, you met two people named Jibril? Like, yeah, there's young Jibril and Sheikh Jibril. Right? So, you know, we talked the other day about al-farq bayn al-khilaf wal-ikhtilaf. Right? There's the difference between khilaf and ikhtilaf. The first one is mustalaha fiqhiyya. The first one is kind of like a juristic term that is for differences that are permissible. We're going to have a difference of opinion. And so in this case, an argument could be made that men could wear an earring so long as it is not in the style within that cultural context that it is the imitation of women. And it could be made mubah, right? It's permissible. Likewise, an argument could be made like la yajuz. No, it's not. And this would be khilaf. There could be an acceptable difference of opinion on this. Where ikhtilaf, as it is mentioned in the Quran, is da'iman mathmum. It's always blameworthy. So, yes, to answer your question, you could make that argument, but to what extent would other Muslims have to follow it? Right? And that's where we have to understand, like, both of those can exist simultaneously. Jaiz wa ghayru jaiz. Yajuz wa la yajuz. Like they both could, you know, they both could exist at the same time. So, like I said, for myself, I find this gesture makes my skin crawl. I just can't bring myself to do that. And specifically as a man. Like as a man, I cannot do that gesture. But I also have to be cautious of respecting, as Allah Ta'ala, لا تحرم ما أحل الله. Do not make haram that which Allah Ta'ala has made halal. Meaning that you have to have a level of reverence of the hudud of Allah. And that there are other categories like makruh or, you know, these kind of like, we don't like it. Like there are many, like the category of makruhat is much bigger than the harumat. So even if you know, and here's the thing, let's say let's say you are alam fulan, and I'm just, you know, whatever, and you make the opinion, the fatwa that men wearing earrings in the West is not permissible because they have their own tradition that where women, once upon a time, women wore that and men did not, and any change of that would be categorized under the tashabbah rijal and nisa, of men imitating women. Okay, tamam. And let's say I follow that. I can potentially get some ajr, however big or small, because it would be something from the makruhat, something disliked. And we know when a thing is makruh, what? If we know that what? فَعَلُهُ مَا فِي إِثْمٍ وَلَكَنْ تَرَكُهُ أَجْرٌ. Right? We know that if we do it, there's no punishment or head for me in this life or in the next. But if I leave it, inshallah, there can be some level of reward. Now, what it is can vary quite a bit. So yes, you can make the argument, but it would be a limited argument in terms of the scope of its application and the requirement of the Muslim community to have to follow it. But don't get me wrong, I feel you. I can't do that.
Last,
Yes.
nowadays, people are piercing everything, not just like here, lip, eyebrow, cheek, forehead. Would that go into the realm of permissible, or that kind of the same?
They would fall into the same law. I mean, even this I know will generally probably really bake some people's noodles. But let's say you take, if you take tattoos, are tattoos haram or halal? By general consensus, as we would say, al-jumhur, haram. Can't do it. But there are some minor dissenting opinions from the ulama that said for those people that in the urf, that they had them and they were not, you know, they didn't have things put on them that were, say, tasweer, like images of living creatures, but they were just maybe like a pattern, like the Maori. There are some minor dissenting opinions to say that they are makruh, meaning what? They still respect the tahrim of the Prophet ﷺ in the jamhur, in the major opinion, that what? If you leave it, which you ought to do, because that's the meaning of something being of karaha. If it's disliked, you leave it, it's better for you to leave it. And if you do, you get a reward for doing it. But if you do it, there's no punishment against you. And there's no need for tawbah or islah. Again, nobody conflate this. That is not the vast majority of opinions. But there are some small, minor opinions that we cannot just throw them out and disregard them, right? That are saying, well, because the culture of tattoos was different from them than it was of the culture of the tattoos for the Arabs. Because, they're saying, well, it's not in Revelation, and perhaps some of the prohibition of this, of the Prophet ﷺ, perhaps is influenced by some cultural understanding. Right? Again, that's not the predominant opinion, but it is a minor opinion that does still have to be taken seriously. So when it comes, that's what we have in our usul, this idea of ada muhakkama, that we derive legislation and rulings, وَتَطْبِيقُهَا, and the application of it, it has to be put in a conversation with the culture. It doesn't mean that the culture is the hakim. It doesn't mean the culture is what decides the ruling. But you cannot completely apply rulings without some cultural considerations. Because, for instance, I remember one of my friends told me this. He's from Philly, right? African American from Philly, grew up in the hood. It's actually somewhat similar to, like, for all those of us in Detroit. Now, when we first saw Arabs wearing a thobe, it's like this dude's wearing a dress. So for us as Americans or Westerners, it's like, man, that looks kind of like a blouse or a feminine piece of clothing, because in our culture, men wear pants. That's why we say, oh, who wears the pants in this house? Now, obviously, because the Prophet ﷺ wore thiyab and the Sahaba wore thiyab and on, but some people will say, well, that's their culture. That's why anybody that can say, like, is it even mustahab or is it mandub to wear a thobe? You find this difficult to make that claim because, one, well, what is the meaning of thobe? Is it thiyab, yani libas, or is it bishakli am or khas? Is it something specific or general? Because, in the language of the ahadith and even in the Quran, it seems sometimes interchangeable between something specific and something general, or sometimes occupying both. So when it comes to these things, which is way off the topic of zakah, it requires, this is why you have to be a person of usul to even begin formulating an argument. This is not an argument that should ever be formulated by amateurs. Now, if you don't like it, you're like, man, I look at them earrings, okay, fine. You have number one, you're under no obligation, even if we could rule it to be, neutral. You're under no obligation to do it. Even if we could rule it, whatever it is, to be mustahab, even if it is something that is highly recommended, you're still under no obligation, right? Al-istihaba laysa huwa al-ijab, right? Wujub. Something that is highly recommended is not the same as something that is mandatory. So when it comes to those things, those types of things should be best left to the people of usul and the ulama to make those conclusions. If you are uncomfortable with it, alhamdulillah, abstain from it, leave from it, and don't engage it. But be careful of telling other people to even feel bad about it necessarily, unless you are really a person that has reached that rank that can comfortably say, I've really, worked out all of the masail and this and that, and I'm going to make this proclamation. So just, be careful of going and stepping, filling your shoes that are a little bit bigger than they are. At the same time, though, if you ain't comfortable with it, leave it alone. Like I said, for me, I cannot do the earring. It's just not going to happen.
Well, we could get you a tattoo.
Well, and in Islam we have tattoos. They're just temporary tattoos. They're called henna, right? Women do this and there's celebrations for things. So alhamdulillah. Like that's what I'm saying. We have to be careful about making a lafaz mutlaq, that these like unconditional statements. Music is haram. If you believe music is haram without any context, you have slandered the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Simple as that. Because he allowed people to sing at weddings and other things, and he did not rebuke them. So when you make the statement, music is haram, without putting it in a context, what kind of music, with what kind of instrumentation, or without instrumentation, and where, if you just say music is haram, mutlaq, you have slandered the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when you talk about things that, that are decontextualized, this is the first sign of an amateur and a very, very dangerous person. We have to respect that one, the Deen Allahi wasi', like the religion of Allah Ta'ala is wide and simple, and we should also respect the fact that none of us are the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah is not speaking, He doesn't speak to us, He doesn't speak to humans anymore like that. There's no, as I said yesterday, there's no 115th verse of the Quran. That's done now. So now we are in Zaman al-Istinbat. Now we have to then extract meanings. So it's just having a level of reverence for that. All right, let's get back on track to talking about the zakah of dhahab and fidda. So he says what zakah is what mafruda, zakah is mandatory, في الذهب والفضة على أي صفة كان, in whatever form that they may take. إلا في الحل المباح, except as it relates to types of jewelry that are permissible, whether for men or women, والمستعمل, and those things that maybe have some type of use. So if they have a use, then you don't pay zakat on it. And if they're worn as like jewelry, you don't pay zakat on it. وتجب بشرطين, right? And then so it becomes obligatory through two conditions. بلوغ النصاب, right? Reaching a certain amount of accumulation, known as the nisab, and also hawalan al-hawl, and it is held and is possessed for a lunar year. And so he continues to say, what nisab al-fidda. So what is the accumulated amount, the limit of having silver? It is what? Mi'ata dirham. So up to 200 dirhams, up to that point, you don't pay zakah. At 200 or over, you pay zakah. Shar'i, as according to the Sharia. So you have to know the weights according to the Sharia. وَهُوَ فِي الذهب, and then the same for gold, is what 20 dinaran. Also the same then for dinar, for gold, then it is to have what 20 dinars according to the Sharia weight. يُضَمُّ أَحَدُ تَقْدَيْنِ إِلَى الْآخِرِ. And then also one type of currency can be combined with the other, right, bil ajaza, in different parts. So, gold and silver. فَمَا اجْتَمَعَ مِنْهُمَا نِصَابٌ فِيهِ الزَّكَاةُ. So if the total reaches the nisab, then the zakah is due. Let me double check the comments for questions. All right, good. And then وَالْوَاجِبْ فِيهِمَا. Now, the obligatory amount, what is it? رُبُّ الْعُشْرِ. It is what? It is essentially 1/4 of 1/10, or what is also known as 2.5%. وزنا في الموزون, as how it is calculated for weight. وعددا في المعدود, and also by counting. So by weight and by counting. So like by weight, if you just have rings or ingots or bullion, then you would weigh it. But if you have the dirham or dirahim or a dinar, shar'iyan, if you have like the actual coins that are minted according to Sharia, then you can do them by count. وَلَهُ أَن يُخْرِجَ الْفِضَّةَ عَنِ الذَّهَبِ وَالْعَكْسِ. one can also then, once you, let's say, once you determine, I have, let's say, as we said, what, it's 200 dirham, right? So if let's say I have 210 silver coins. So obviously going over that amount, those 10 would have to be counted of what I would pay. I can pay what is on them in silver or gold. So the reverse is actually more common. Let's say I have, 25, or let's say I have 22 dinars, like gold coins. And now I have to pay 2.5% of those 2 coins. Well, how do I do that with, there are only 2? What am I going to boil them down or cut them up? It'd be a lot easier just to simply pay the zakat due on them, probably in silver, because it's a smaller denomination, right? So you can pay your zakah that's due on your gold in silver, and likewise you can pay what's due on your silver in gold. So that's all you're saying.
But let me ask you a question. If those coins, so they wouldn't be weighed?
Well, the coins are already weighed. I'm saying they have to be Sharia compliant coins, not another. Let's say you have like, what do they call, like the golden eagle dollar, or like, there's coins minted everywhere in the world, and they will have different weights and whatnot. So in that case, they would be weighed because they may have different weights, and then you have to determine that based upon your weight. However, if you have Sharia compliant coins, then you could just pay them in coins, right? Or in the case, let's say you have a bunch of jewelry, or not in jewelry because you don't pay on jewelry that you wear, but let's say you have some gold bullion, right? And it could be, or gold ingots, right? They could be of varying different weights. So then those you would not count, but those you would weigh, right? So that's why he puts in, if you're going to use Sharia compliant coins, then you can pay also in Sharia compliant coins. But if they're not minted according to Sharia, they're just weighed out at whatever weight, then they have to be done by weight. وَتَجِبُ الزَّكَاةِ فِي النَّقْدِ الْمُعَاسِرِ. And then likewise, zakah is also obligatory on contemporary forms of currency. لأنه حل محل الدنانير والدراهم, because they have taken the place of dinars and dirhams fil athman, in terms of value, والقيم, and how they're used in transactions, right? So if you got dollar bills, then those can be determined for zakah, and of course it's always going to be pegged to whatever the market value of gold is or whatnot, right? وَيُقَدَّرُ نِصَابْ كُلَّ عُمْلَةٍ, and then the nisab for every currency is estimated بِمَا يُسَاوِي قِيمَةَ نِصَابَ الذَّهَبِ. And as I just said, so like, let's say the US dollar. Right now, if we look up, let's say US dollar to gold, what's the ratio? So right now, will this tell me here? So right now, I believe $1 US is worth about $2,442.74. So one ounce of gold is equal to that, right? So 1 ounce of gold is going to be equal to $2,442.74. Now you have to convert that ounce to the weight of the Shari'i weight, which is, we're not going to do that right now, but that's something you can reference. And if you're curious, you can go look in like the process, like Shaykh Joe Bradford explains in his book about zakah. So this is more about the usul and whatnot, and the kayfiyah, but not the tatbiq. This is like the foundational principles and the how-tos from a theoretical point of view, but the practical applications, you can go look up those things. But that's right, it's going to be pegged to gold, right? So whatever your modern currency, yen, pesos, right, is going to be pegged to the value of gold. Yawm al-wujub, the day that your zakah is due. So the day that your zakah is due, that's when you check the gold price compared to your fiat currency, and then you pay it on that. Not projecting or, well, you know, right now, you know, gold is less, you know, or, you know, whatever, you know, 30 days ago, but not, no. The day that you pay your zakah, that's the day that you calculate. So I made a couple of simple little example scenarios, right? So the statement, one can give gold for silver and silver for gold, means that if a person owes zakah on gold, they can pay it in silver and vice versa. So for instance, let's take the gold example. If a person has 100 grams of gold, the zakah on that 100 grams, 2.5%, would be 2.5 grams of gold. And so likewise, you could pay that in gold or silver. And so if you had 1,000 grams of silver, then of course you'd owe 25 grams of silver. And those, so paying zakah with the equivalent value. If a person owes 2.5 grams of gold in zakah, but prefers to pay it in silver, they can do so. If the current market value of 2.5 grams of gold is equal to 200 grams of silver, the person can give 200 grams of silver instead of 2.5 grams of gold. Right? So just how those are interchangeable. Next he says, وَلَا يُزَكِي الضَّائِعْ مِنْ مَالِهِ حَتَّى يَجِدُهُ. So one does not pay zakah on wealth that you lost until it's found, right? Until you find it. حَتَّى يَجِدَهُ. وَلَا الْمَقْصُوبِ. Nor on wealth that was seized. So if you have some gold or silver or cattle or crops or any of the things that zakah can be applicable to, if those are seized by like a government or something, you don't pay zakah on them until they're so let's say, for instance, you inherit some wealth from your parents who passed, but there's some legal issue and their property, meaning their gold and silver, is temporarily seized. Now, once you would take possession of that, then obviously, and you held it for a year, you would pay possession of it. But let's say it's wrapped up in court for like 5 years. You don't pay zakah on it until you take possession of it and then hold it for an entire lunar year. وَلَا مَا كَانَ دَيْنًا لَهُ فِي الذِّمَّةِ غَيْرِهِ. And a person also does not pay zakah on a debt either owed to him by somebody else, right? So let's say you loan somebody $1,000 or 1,000 grams of gold or whatever, right? You don't, until you get that back, because you're not in possession of it, right? You don't pay on it, and then you hold it for a year. And then also he says, من ثمن لسلعة باعها, or whether on the price of a certain good until the item is sold, meaning so that you take the money of it. أو بدلا من قرض أقدره, or a loan that has been given, or even what? أو مهر في نكاح, or like a dowry. Let's say you give your wife, I don't know, $5,000 cash, or the equivalent of $5,000 in gold, right? If it's in a dowry, until you receive you receive it in full or in nisab amount. It says حتى يقبضه كله أو نصابا منه فيزكيه لسنة واحدة فقط. Then if you were then to take possession of it, you only pay zakah on it for 1 year if you meet the passage of that time. ومن ملك نصابا من المال الباطن. So if someone owns or possesses a nisab amount, he said, well, let's say silver, like 200 coins or whatever it is, right? If someone owns and possesses the nisab amount of hidden wealth, al-mal al-batin, and what does mal al-batin mean? It can mean what? Naqdi, cash, right? It can mean cash. وتعلق بذمة الدين, or it could be a debt, because in some ways, like if you borrowed $1,000 from somebody, right? You have that $1,000, but it ain't really yours in terms of possession until you've paid it back. So there's a levy on that, so right, you don't pay that. وَالْحَالٌ أَوْ مُؤَجَّلٌ, whether due or deferred. So whether that person is due right now or they're giving you some time. ومبلغه يستغرق المال أو ينقص. That he said whether that's due, and then also that either equals or reduces the well below the nisab. Because let's say you wouldn't normally meet your nisab because you're broke, but then you borrow like $10,000. Oh man, I got money. If that pushes you above, it's not really pushing you above because it's dying, it's debt, right? So that's not calculated right towards it.
They don't pay on debt.
You don't pay on debt, right? That's debt. Yeah, it's debt, right? It just depends. When you say a loan, it's like, where do you stand in relation to the loan? Are you the debtor or the creditor? Like, are you the person that's giving out the loan or taking the loan, right? So, but yeah, zakah is not paid on debt.
Well, one last.
Yeah.
So, let's say you had $10,000 of your own money, but you borrowed another $10,000.
That's different.
You got to pay on that $10,000.
If it's money that
You have.
yeah, like if that's your 10 grand, that's yours,
Right.
or 10 grand of gold or silver, whatever, cash, gold, silver, and that's your money that you have held for an entire year, then yes, you pay on that because it's not dying. But that other 10 grand that you borrowed for some reason does not go into the calculation. So you only pay 2.5% on the what you held that's yours, not on the 2.5%, right? That is for the debt. Now let's say you took out that 10 grand because you're running a business or something, and you make some profits. And let's say you make $3,000 profit, and you hold on to that 3 grand. Now, from that $10,000 loan, you've paid it back, you've made your $3,000 of raw profit, and then if that is held for the year, now that you pay, so you could say in the total, at the end of that year, you actually now have $13,000. Then obviously you pay your zakah on the 13 grand, not on 20 grand, right?
But is there some opinion in regards to that 10 grand that you have, which is yours, should be paid towards the debt first
Yes.
before you even take the zakah?
Right. So exactly. You have to, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, you would calculate it off it, but then what you have to do now, both the money you're holding and the debts that you owed, they're all lumped together to determine what is your nisab. So in the case of like 10 grand in cash and 10 grand in debt, well, they kind of like cancel each other out. Now, if you have some other assets, like some livestock or some crops or some gold or some silver or whatever, some stocks or whatever, then, those will go into the factoring of what your nisab is. But if you got just 10 grand in cash and 10 grand in a loan, well, obviously they're going to cancel each other out. Right. So he says that لم تجب عليه الزكاة فيه إذا ذاك. Zakah is not obligatory on it at the time that he has no other means to repay the debt. So just as you were saying, that's what he's going into, right? So if you have 10 grand in savings and you have a $10,000 loan and you have no other means, then obviously that goes towards it. So like I said, they're basically going to cancel each other out. So the last, I gave a couple of examples on hidden wealth. So I said, imagine Ahmed has 5 grand cash, and that pushes him above his nisab for zakah. So he's going to have to calculate, his zakah off of that. But Ahmed also has a $5,000 debt that's going to be due soon. So since his debt equals his wealth, he basically has no surplus, so there's no zakah that's due. And then because Ahmed has no other assets or means to repay his debt, again, they're basically going to cancel each other out. So according to the ruling, zakah is not obligatory in Ahmed's cash at this time because his debt canceled out his wealth. I'm not saying that Ahmed sounds a lot like Mark, but it's quite a possibility because welcome to Debt America. So yes, that's a basic mechanics. Now again, there are other things. Just because your debt happened, I mean, this is a simple scenario. Your debt is equal to your loan and they cancel each other out. But you could have other assets that have to be considered, that there still might be things due upon, right? So I don't want it to say like, oh, well, we only got $5,000 in cash. I got a $5,000 debt, so I'm done with zakah calculations. No, you still got to figure out what other assets you may have that zakah would be applicable on. But just to understand, debt and zakah can have an effect on each other in terms of how you calculate. So that is going to cover this. We'll probably have another maybe 2 sessions because there's a lot of notes. But again, I wanted to make this into small, digestible blocks. I'll put all of the technical details about livestock and crops, which again, for the vast majority of us, is not going to be applicable, but you still should know it. I'll put that up on the website, and then I'll also put today's session along with the notes up there as well. And I'll probably put another little quiz up there as I did last time, just to help reinforce some of the information to stick in our heads, inshallah. Any other questions before we conclude? Yes, sir.
So nisab, I was a little confused, but in this session, your nisab is what's over, or can we say what's over your livelihood that you use, that you need to pay for your livelihood. So whatever's over that, or?
So the nisab we can think of as like a threshold. Nisab is like a threshold, a minimum or a threshold. And then there are only certain types of wealth that zakah is due upon. And so then what you do is you say, okay, I have cash, I have gold, I have silver, I have crops, I have livestock, I've got stocks and bonds and okay, all that. But then I got all this debt, right? And again, this is just a simple example. I got a loan and I owe debt to here and there, and then I've got nafaqah, I've got maintenance, and all these things that are subtracted from that. So this is why you can actually have, theoretically, dhahiran, a very wealthy person, a person that makes a lot of money. And they got a really nice car, they live in a really expensive house or whatnot, and yet they may, in the end, pay very little zakat because they also just carry a lot of debt. They may carry a lot of debt, or their money is tied up in things. And so this is what, and the reverse, you can have proportionately a relatively, I won't say poor person, because it's interesting, the definition of wealth in Islam, or being wealthy, do you meet the nisab or not? Our cultural definition of wealth is certain amount of zeros in your bank account and on and on and on. But in Islam, if you pay zakat, you are wealthy to a certain extent. So that's why even, again, on the appearance, a person that could be of very humble means, they don't have a ton of cash, they got a little bit. They live in a simple house, and they have this or that, and they got a little bit of assets of which zakat is due upon. Now, the zakat won't be a lot, but they may still pay zakat, where another person could be very wealthy, but because they've got so much debt and other things that their money isn't tied up into, they may not even owe zakat. Right? Not saying that will be the case every time, but it is theoretically possible. Yes?
In my meetings with most of our money community, Muslim community, they all believe that they have so much debt leverage up that they're not out.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, now, of course, there's a difference between leveraged from a sort of taxation point of view and finding loopholes and whatnot. And then there's just, zakah, which again is about what? Purification and growth. Right? Again, because the meaning of zakah as a verb means, tahara, like tahara wa kabura. Right? The two meanings of zakah is to purify, but also to grow. Right? So, the outlook of secular wealth is very different than the outlook of Islam upon wealth, and therefore the definition of how a person is considered to be wealthy may be somewhat different than the Islamic point of view.
So another question, when you were talking about paying like silver, gold with silver, and could you pay with something of value other than silver or gold or cash? Let's say I had a date farm and I wanted to pay, give it all and weight in dates or whatever a value. Could it be transferable?
I mean, so if you think about it, like, that's a great question. So anybody that couldn't hear, can you pay your zakah that's due? Do you have to pay it only in gold or silver or cash, or can you pay it in other forms of assets? So the simple answer is yes, but I want to make it before anybody runs out. Okay, great, I'll pay it in seashells. No, what I'm saying is Zakat al-Fitr, right? So at the end of Ramadan, we have Eid al-Fitr, right? The zakah that we pay for Eid al-Fitr is actually al-Muhadhdhab is what? The preferred is to pay it in what? Food. Now this is different than zakat al-mal or amwal, right? It's different than the zakah due upon wealth, but the simple answer is that yes, depending on the set of circumstances, right? Because the Eid al-Fitr and the zakah of Eid al-Fitr is about what? Feeding people, breaking the fast and making sure people eat. Same thing actually for Eid al-Adha. You make sure the udhiyah, so that people have some food to eat right? But generally speaking, and it's important, like, do I have to pay my zakah in gold or silver? Can I pay it in a fiat? Can I pay it in naqdi, like fulus? Yes, you can. So people talk about you can't pay your zakah in cash. No, it's not true. You can't. Right? You can't. In fact, you may find it hard to drop off some gold bullion. You might, it might be a little bit tricky to do. Although, obviously, you can. I mean, I think the trick is, well, not the trick, but the challenge in the West is that, one, the very idea and the reality of transaction is so far beyond what the Sharia encourages us to deal with, is things that have like intrinsic value, like gold and silver. Even people will then try to argue, well, gold doesn't really have any intrinsic value. Well, it does enough to the extent of the Sharia, right? If you want to get into some metaphysical realm, then okay, the only thing that's worth of value is dhikrullah, right? So if you want to get that, metaphysical with it, fine. But to the extent of the Sharia, gold and silver have intrinsic value. But in the West, unfortunately, we moved away from that, in the 19th century. We moved away from, where at least even once upon a time, the idea of a dollar bill, right? Because it's like, what is a bill? Like when you get your electric bill, that means something's due. You got to cough up something because it's due. That's why they call it a dollar bill, because it was, what's due, like if I give you this dollar, then what's due to you as the holder of that promissory note of that bill is actually the bank has got to give you some amount of gold or silver. That's what it was for. That doesn't exist anymore. You can't go to the bank and say, okay, I got this $20 bill, give me my X amount of ounces or grams of gold, right? In fact, now you would have to very specifically go to like a bullion, gold exchange and get your gold, because we just don't, unfortunately, and it wasn't only Nixon that did it. There was a lot of things that happened even before Nixon of moving away from a gold standard. Although you could say he was kind of like maybe the nail in the coffin. So yeah, it's obviously it's a challenge. So yes, it can be, but the preferred Shari'i method for Zakat al-Amwal is to pay it, as he says, right, that if you go back to the slide here, what does he title it? He titles it what? Zakat al-Dhahabi wal-Fiddati wa ma jara مَجْرَاهُمَا, the zakah that's due on gold and silver, and what resembles it. And so the best way to pay your zakah on gold and silver and what resembles it, meaning currency, is to then pay the zakah in gold and silver or cash, because that's what we're talking about here, right? But if you have crops, like let's say you have a bunch of dates or corn or whatever that is, or you have a bunch of cows. I mean, you can pay that. So we went through that actually the last week. Remember, it said, like, if you have X number of she-camels or goats, right? If you have more than 200, then you got to give what? 2 or 20 or whatever the numbers were. So obviously you're paying in that. Now, could you give the gold amount? I mean, these things are exchangeable, but it's preferable if you can stay within the same lane. Stay within the same lane. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Would you say now that extends to digital currency, Bitcoins, and
I mean, so as he says, وَمَا جَرَى مَجْرَاهُمَا. So if Bitcoin is indeed, and so now here we are going to get, no, it's important, right? Is Bitcoin a currency? This is like the major question of which there's still quite a bit of debate amongst the ulama. I think now there's more weight leaning towards Bitcoin at least having a currency-like function, even though it is obviously not only a currency, but it appears to have, or in other types of crypto, right, having a currency-like function. So if it falls into وَمَا جَرَى مَجْرَاهُمَا, then you would pay, not only could you pay your zakah in Bitcoin, which seems odd, like putting on an earring, but zakah would be due upon it. And this is something still debated, but I think now there are more learning. And again, this would be something that I would definitely leave to the purview of more experts like Shaykh Joe and others, right? But I've seen some of the white papers and some of the conversations around it.
He has it in his Zakāh handbook.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm just saying, there are some still scholars who are like, man, this is just toy money. This is like, it's make believe. But yeah, I mean, these are things. But that's why he said, like, gold and silver, and what basically kind of, you could say what flows like it. Jara, like, because for a thing to be jari or majra, it has to have liquidity. That's why, how do you, gold, it can be as musta'mal, it can be as a utility. You can, I'm sure there's probably some gold in this thing somewhere, right? I mean, you use gold in electronics and even in medical utensils like gold and silver they can make, because I guess they have some, maybe antimicrobial this or that, or obviously like dental implants, right? Those metals were used. So they can also have that's why you don't pay zakah on your gold fillings or silver fillings, right? You don't pay zakah on that. Because they have a function, a utility. And therefore, but at the same time, I guess if you was really desperate, you could take out your gold or silver fillings, melt them down, and take it over to the shop and get some money out of it theoretically, right? And so there's liquidity to gold and silver. There's also liquidity to fulus. I know, we're all big on the creature from Jekyll Island, right? All about fiat currency. But, I can take my fiat currency and go down to the bullion shop and I can go trade that in for some gold or silver. So it's liquid. And it seems that I could kind of do the same with Bitcoin. Like I could theoretically cash in my Bitcoin for US dollars, which I could then take and cash in for gold or silver. and vice versa. So it flows, right? The issue is if there's no flowing, there's no liquidity. Right, so that's part of the, these are getting a little bit beyond the lesson for today, but these are some of the theoretical considerations in the field of zakah. So, let me see, let me just double check there weren't any other questions online, so alhamdulillah. Again, I'll also drop it in there. I highly recommend it as a workbook. If you want to be able to calculate your zakah, Sheikh Joe Bradford has a great book you can order. It's very inexpensive, called The Simple Zakah Guide. I'll put a link on the website, inshallah. It's a great resource, and it's done in the style of like a workbook. So you just basically plug in your assets, and you're able to determine what your zakah is. So I'll put that in the link as well, inshallah. And we will see you next week, inshallah, for the fourth session. وصلوات الله تعالى على النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. الحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم.